This week is going to be a culmination of all of the drawing skills that we have practiced over the last couple of weeks. And we are going to be creating a still life composition using whatever you have handy of 5 to 7 different objects. I have some odds and ends. I've tried to create a composition that has different heights. I've got some interesting negative spaces, and I will be using this composition of 7 objects for my first step, which is going to be creating thumbnails. So, thumbnails are small little practice sketches that you can use to kind of game plan out what you want to do for your project. And I recommend that you trace either around an index card. I'm filming today at my husband's office. He doesn't have any index cards, so I just traced around my cell phone, honestly. So about 3 inches by 5 inches, and these are going to be quick little sketches just to play around and practice with composition. There's a couple of different things that I recommend with this. So the way that I have my composition set up right now is I can see all of my objects, and my objects are wider than they are tall, at least from my perspective. Practicing my camera skills. So I have my thumbnail set up long ways, but for my first thumbnail, I'm going to turn my paper so that it is horizontal because my objects are set up wider than they are tall. So I'm going to just practice out, sketching out kind of where stuff is sitting, where it's laying. You are going to do 6 of these total. And thumbnails are not supposed to be finished drawings. You're kind of game planning out where things are. You're playing with proportions, you're playing with setup, and you're trying to see which cluster of objects is going to be the most visually interesting. And it's also a chance for you to practice playing with some of your observational drawing skills. So, where do objects fall in relationship to each other? How do they relate to each other? The one thing that I recommend for this is as you're playing around with your different compositions, should be a little bit taller, practice with making sure that you have at least 5 objects in whatever composition you choose to include. It's important that you do an odd number of objects because people's brains like to kind of fill in gaps and group things together. So if you have objects that people can put together in pairs, it's a little bit less visually interesting because people look at your piece and they're like, oh, okay, so those two go together, those two go together. And there aren't any like question marks like, oh, how do these pieces relate to each other? So it's usually a good idea to do an odd number of objects. So this is my super quick thumbnail sketch. I'm not going to bore you guys with doing like a full entire drawing for the demo. But then my next one I'm going to try and include, I'm going to zoom in just here for the taller Arnold Palmer bottle and the Lego block and the stapler. So play around with different combinations of objects. If you do a good job of setting up your still life in a place that is hopefully something that you can either revisit safely, which means it's not in a really high traffic area in your house. So like maybe the kitchen table is not the best place for you to set up your still life because I assume that you will be eating there a couple of times a day, and you'll have to take your still life apart, put it back together, take it apart, put it back together, and that can make it a little bit more challenging. for you to actually complete your assignment. So hopefully you can find a spot that is kind of out of the way and isn't going to be a really high traffic area for you to set up your stuff. Of course, if that's not possible, you can do what I always have to do when we do still lifes in the classroom, because I, of course, have to change everything out between my different class periods. I photograph where everything is at, and then I can make small adjustments. So I would set up this still life, this composition of my 7 objects. I would photograph it. I would start to work on my thumbnail sketches. And then if you have it set up at the dining room table or something like that, your kitchen table, you can always use the photo to adjust, like, oh, okay, so do I need to move this a little bit more this way? How close to the face is the red block? Is it more this way? Is it more that way? If you have photographs of it before you get started, that can be really easy. Another thing I suggest is taking a look at it if you have it set up in a central location, like in the middle of a table or maybe the middle of a desk. What does it look like if you change your perspective? And you can play with this with your thumbnails, like adjust it a little bit to the side. What does it look like if you're looking at it more from the top? If you zoom in, ooh, camera skills. If you zoom in on just a couple of objects, how does that change? And that's what you're going to do while you're playing with your thumbnail sketches. You will need a grand total of 6 thumbnail sketches, and you're going to be turning those in before the rest of your project, because I would love to give you some feedback and some thoughts on your most successful composition. Of course, ultimately you get to choose which of those compositions you think is the best. That you're playing with your thumbnail sketches. You get to make the final decision because it's your artwork and you are the artist. But I will give you some suggestions and some tips and tricks. When you move into your final drawing, ideally you are going to be creating a final still life of 5 to 7 objects. And the things that we have practiced so far are your observational drawing skills. Talking and writing is hard. Observational drawing. So you're looking for accuracy. And remember, some of those keys for observational drawing is you are looking very closely and carefully at what you are drawing. So at least 2 times longer. You are not making assumptions about what you're drawing. As soon as you look away and you're just focusing on your paper and you're drawing on your paper and not looking up at the objects that you're drawing, that's when you start to make mistakes, because your obnoxious left brain is going to try and take over the drawing task, and it will make assumptions and then it will start making mistakes. So really look at least twice as much as you're looking at your paper. The other thing that we have practiced is using values. So those are our highlights and shadows with our sweet treat drawings. And I want you to include a full range of values. Like the sweet treats, you will not be using color on this. You are just using pencil. Color mixing and adding highlights and shadows with color is a whole other can of worms that we won't be dealing with this shortened remote learning trimester. So don't worry about adding color to it. That's just going to make things more complicated, but you can really concentrate on the highlights and the shadows, the full range of values. So if I tilt this back up. Oh, come on, camera stand. So as I look at my bottle, I can see that I've got some really bright highlights here, highlights on this Lego block. I've got some medium values on the inside of my cup. I've got some great dark values where these cast shadows are all in between here, and dark values over here on the stapler, dark values over here. And you're going to be using these highlights and shadows in that full range of value. I had you guys create value scales that had 6 different values in them. So I want to see at least 6 values in your final pieces. You also have a grading rubric for this week. You will be filling out your rubric yourself. This is a self-assessment rubric. It will be editable on this week's Teams assignment. So you will be able to go in and type your responses to the reflection questions and then either highlight or just add one of those circle symbols on top of the box that you think best describes your work. Keep in mind that one of the key pieces for that rubric is going to be completing your 6 thumbnails before you finish your final project. We are documenting the stages of the creative process. That's one of the standards that we're trying to hit this trimester from our National Art Standards. So submitting those thumbnails, taking in feedback from me with that midweek due date is going to be really important too. And then you'll have a couple of days to work on finishing your final still life drawing. Email me if you have any questions. I think that's everything. I will include more in the assignment description. Make sure you read that. You'll have a couple of photographs that you're submitting this week.